personal reflection and vulnerability. When I think back to the day I got married, I can still feel the weight of that moment on my shoulders. I was 18, so full of excitement and optimism, yet at the same time I was terrified. They say love makes you brave, but nobody told me that sometimes love makes you scared too. I remember the way my heart raced as I stood at the altar, the vows echoing in my mind like they were being spoken by someone else, someone older, wiser, someone who knew exactly what they were getting into. But that wasn't me. I was still learning who I was, what I wanted, and where my place in the world truly was. At 18, I was so sure of everything, and yet, in the quiet moments after the wedding, when it was just me and my new spouse sitting together, I felt a deep, unsettling fear. It was the kind of fear that makes you question yourself, makes you wonder if you were ready for this lifelong commitment, even if you promised yourself you were. There were times in the early days when I lay awake at night, wondering if I was doing the right thing. Was I too young? Too naive? Had I missed something everyone else seemed to know about relationships and marriage that I didn't? Those first few years were a blur. I spent so much of that time trying to prove I was strong, trying to convince myself and everyone around me that I could handle this, that I could make it work. I didn't want to admit that I was struggling because I thought that would mean I was failing. But the truth was, I wasn't failing, I was learning. I was stumbling, yes, I was falling, yes, but I was learning how to pick myself back up each time. I didn't want to be the person who showed weakness. In our culture, especially as a young woman, there's this pressure to have it all together. You're supposed to be calm, composed, and in control. I wanted to be that person so badly. But there were so many moments when I was anything but calm. I was scared. I was overwhelmed. And most of all, I was vulnerable. There's a strange thing that happens when you marry young. You want to hold onto the image of who you thought you were supposed to be, but life doesn't work that way. It's messy. It's real. It makes you confront parts of yourself you didn't know existed. The insecurities, the doubts, the fear that maybe you're not enough. At times, it felt like the weight of the world was on my shoulders and no one could see it. I felt like I had to carry it all, keep everything together. But the truth is, I didn't have to. I didn't have to be perfect, and I didn't have to do it alone. That's when I learned the most about myself, not in the moments of success, but in the moments of vulnerability. When I could finally admit that I didn't have all the answers, that I was scared, that I was still figuring things out, I started to grow. I started to understand that vulnerability wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a sign of strength. The strength to admit that I needed help. The strength to ask for support when I felt lost. The strength to say, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm willing to learn. And that's the thing about vulnerability, it forces you to be real. When you stop pretending to have it all figured out, when you stop hiding behind the facade of us having everything in place, you create space for real growth. You allow yourself to be human. You allow yourself to be imperfect. And in that imperfection, you find the greatest strength. I was 18 when I got married. I was still a kid in many ways. But through the years, through the tears, the doubts, the heartbreak, and the healing, I learned the most important lesson: it's okay to not have it all figured out. It's okay to not always be strong. It's okay to fall. What matters is that you get back up. What matters is that you keep moving forward. And through it all, you let yourself feel. You let yourself be vulnerable. Because in the end, that's what makes us truly human. Family and societal expectations. When I look back at the decision to get married at 18, I can't ignore the powerful forces that played into that choice, forces that weren't just coming from within me, but from all around me. Society has this way of putting pressure on young people, especially young women, to follow a very specific path. The idea of what you're supposed to do, when you're supposed to do it, and how you're supposed to get there is so ingrained in us, it's almost invisible. From a young age, I was taught that love and marriage were part of the blueprint for life. There's an unwritten rule that once you find someone you love, once you're in a relationship that feels right, the next logical step is to get married. That's what people around me expected, maybe not in so many words, but in the way they talked about it, the way they looked at me when I was dating someone, the way they would comment, oh, you two are so perfect together, when's the wedding? It was as if marriage wasn't a choice, but a requirement, a part of the checklist that you cross off. Graduate check, get a job check, get married, check. In somewhere in the back of my mind, I believed that if I didn't follow that script, I was somehow failing. Failing to meet the expectations of my family, my community, and even myself. There's this subtle but powerful messaging that marriage is a natural step in the progression of life, that it defines you, that it somehow validates your adulthood. I could feel the eyes of my family on me. Everyone had their own idea of what my future should look like. Some of them had been married young too, so it was almost like a rite of passage, a family tradition. You're 18, it's time to settle down and start your life. My parents, while loving and supportive, wanted to see me make decisions they could understand, decisions they could support without hesitation. And for them, marriage seemed like the right path, the responsible thing to do. But beneath all that well-meaning advice, there was an unspoken weight. I was a young woman, and the expectations placed on me were heavy. The idea that marriage would complete me, that it would somehow define my worth and give me a sense of purpose, was something that I felt not only from my family, but from society at large. I wasn't just getting married for me. I was getting married to meet the expectations of a world that says, this is what you do. This is when you do it. And let me tell you, as much as I loved my partner and as much as I thought I was ready, there were times when I wondered if I was truly following my own heart, or if I was following the script that had been handed to me by my family, by society, by the world around me. The pressure to conform to those expectations sometimes felt overwhelming, and there were moments I questioned whether I was doing what I wanted or what I was supposed to do. What made it even harder was the fear of judgment. I was 18, just out of high school. My friends were still figuring out who they were, what they wanted to do with their lives. And here I was, making a decision that would define my entire future. It was hard not to feel like I was being watched, like every step I took was being evaluated, not just by the people closest to me, but by the entire world. You two young people would whisper, "You don't know what you're getting into." And they had a point. How could I possibly know everything there was to know about marriage at 18? I barely knew who I was as an individual. But there was this tug of war happening inside me. On one side, there was the pressure to follow what was expected of me, get married, have a family, settle down. On the other, there was this quiet voice inside of me asking, is this my choice? It wasn't that I didn't love my partner or believe in what we had, but there were times when the weight of what everyone thought I should be doing was more suffocating than the love I felt. I had to come to terms with the fact that it wasn't just my desires at play. I was also trying to meet the desires and expectations of those around me. The hardest part was that no one ever talks about the conflict between societal pressures and personal readiness. We talk a lot about love, but we don't talk enough about what it means to be ready for marriage, or what it means to make such a monumental decision when you haven't fully experienced the world on your own terms. I started to realize that society often views marriage as the final destination, the end point where everything falls into place. But marriage isn't an end, it's a beginning, and it doesn't come with a roadmap. It's something that requires constant work, reflection, and growth. And yet, even knowing all this, the voices of family and society didn't easily fade away. They continued to echo in my mind, making me second-guess myself, questioning my choices, wondering if I was doing things the right way. Could I have waited? Could I have explored life more on my own before making such a big commitment? Or was I just trying to live up to a standard that didn't really fit me? As I moved forward in my marriage, I began to understand that expectations, whether from family, society, or even my own preconceived ideas, can be suffocating if you let them. What I realized over time was that the real work wasn't just about building a life with my spouse, it was about building my own life. One that wasn't dictated by the expectations of others, but by my own understanding of what I wanted, what I needed, and who I wanted to become. Family wants the best for you, and society has its ideals, but at the end of the day, it's your life. The expectations others place on you don't have to define you, even if they are loud, persistent, and well-meaning. Sometimes you have to silence those voices long enough to hear your own dot. When I think about the years that followed after I got married at 18, I see them as a journey of transformation. The kind of transformation that only comes when you're forced to confront parts of yourself that you'd never imagined existed. Marriage, especially at such a young age, doesn't just change the relationship between two people, it changes you. And I wasn't prepared for that. I thought I knew who I was, but marriage pushed me into a new version of myself, a version that I didn't even recognize at times. At 18, I had a picture of what marriage would look like in my mind. I imagined a life filled with love, laughter, and shared dreams. But what I didn't anticipate were the moments when love became hard, when it required more than just feelings, it required action, sacrifice, and sometimes painful compromise. I was suddenly responsible not just for myself, but for another person. And that responsibility, that commitment, forced me to grow in ways I hadn't expected. At first, I was overwhelmed by how much I had to learn. It wasn't just about managing a household or making decisions as a team. It was about discovering who I really was beneath the layers of what I thought I should be. I thought marriage would give me the answers, would make me feel settled. But instead, it often left me with more questions about who I was and what I wanted out of life. I'll be honest with you, there were times when I felt like I was drowning in uncertainty. I didn't know how to balance the expectations of being a wife with the reality of being a young woman trying to figure out what I wanted out of life. There were moments when I felt like I was losing myself, like the person I was before the marriage, before the vows, was slowly slipping away, and I didn't know how to hold on to her. It's easy to lose yourself when you're constantly trying to make everyone else happy, when you're trying to live up to all the roles that are expected of you. And marriage at 18 only amplified that feeling. I thought I had to have it all figured out right away. I thought I had to be the perfect wife, the perfect partner, the perfect version of everything I was supposed to be. But what I learned was that perfection is a lie. And in my pursuit of it, I was missing the most important part of the journey, the part where I learned to be real with myself. Not the version of myself that others wanted me to be, not the version that society demanded, but the raw, unfiltered, imperfect person I was becoming. What they don't tell you about marriage is that it isn't just about building a life for someone else. It's about building yourself too. The relationship might start as an us, but it quickly becomes an I and a you as well. Because in learning how to love someone else, you also learn how to love yourself. You learn to set boundaries, to speak up for what you need, to stand up for what you believe in. You learn that it's okay to disagree, and that it doesn't mean you don't love each other. It means you're both evolving as individuals, and that's a part of growth. Marriage made me confront the parts of myself that I didn't like, the insecurities, the fears, the doubts I had carried with me since childhood. I had to face them head on. When you're suddenly responsible for someone else's happiness, when you're living in a partnership where your every decision impacts another person, you can't hide from your issues. You can't run from your insecurities. You have to deal with them. And that's what marriage forced me to do. It forced me to dig deep into myself, to confront the parts of my past that I hadn't fully healed from. And that was hard, really hard. But it was also the most important work I could have done. I discovered that growth isn't linear. There's no clear path from where you start to where you end up. There are bumps, setbacks, mistakes, and moments where you wonder if you'll ever get it right. And you won't. You won't get everything right. But with every wrong turn, you learn something valuable. With every failure, you grow stronger, more resilient, more aware of who you are and what you need. Marriage at 18 also taught me how to navigate the complexities of being both a partner and an individual. It made me realize that I didn't have to lose myself in the process of loving someone else. For a long time, I thought that was the key to a successful marriage, to completely merge with my spouse, to be so intertwined that I didn't know where he ended and I began. But over time, I learned that you can love someone deeply and still maintain your own identity. You can be a whole person and still choose to share your life with someone else. It was in those moments of self-discovery, when I finally accepted that I didn't have to have all the answers, that I started to grow. I realized that growth comes not from having everything figured out, but from being open to learning about yourself, about others, and about the world. It was through the challenges, the hard days, the struggles with communication, and the sacrifices that I began to understand my own capacity for change. I began to realize that I wasn't the same person I was when I got married. I wasn't the same person I was even a year ago. And that's okay. That's part of the journey. Marriage didn't give me all the answers, but it taught me how to ask better questions. It taught me that there is no perfect version of myself. And that's where the beauty lies. Growth is messy. It's uncomfortable. It forces you to deal with things you'd rather ignore. But it's through that discomfort that you begin to find who you truly are, not just as a wife or a mother or a daughter, but as a person in your own right, not the reality vs. The fantasy of marriage. When I was 18 and dreaming of marriage, I thought I knew exactly what it would look like. I had all these visions in my head, visions of long walks in the park, candlelit dinners, spontaneous acts of romance, and a love so perfect that nothing could ever shake it. I had read enough fairy tales and watched enough romantic comedies to believe that marriage was this beautiful, seamless thing where everything fell into place once you said, "I do." I thought that the love we shared would carry us through anything, that we'd be able to solve any problem as long as we were together. I thought marriage was the ultimate destination, the prize you got for finding your soulmate. But the reality was much different. The truth is, I wasn't prepared for how challenging marriage would be. The first few months, heck, even the first few years were filled with things I hadn't expected. We weren't just building a life together, we were building ourselves in ways that weren't always smooth or easy. What I learned the hard way was that love, while beautiful and all-consuming, is not always the fairy tale you imagine. Love is messy, love is complicated, and in a marriage, love is work. I remember in the beginning thinking that if we loved each other enough, everything else would just fall into place. That was the fantasy. The fantasy was that if we just cared deeply enough, the communication would be perfect, the arguments would be rare, and we'd always understand each other. I remember believing that as long as we were in love, we'd never grow apart, we'd never face real struggles. The picture I had painted in my mind was one of smooth sailing, where all the hard stuff was either avoided or just magically worked out by the sheer force of our devotion. But when the reality set in, I realized how naive I had been. The early days of marriage brought challenges I wasn't ready for. Suddenly, the little quirks that I once found endearing about my partner started to drive me crazy. And I'm sure I wasn't always easy to live with either. The honeymoon phase fades faster than you think, and what's left is real life, the kind of life that demands compromise, patience, and understanding, sometimes even on days when you feel like you don't have anything left to give. The first big shock to my fantasy came when we faced our first major argument. The kind of argument where it feels like you're not just disagreeing about the issue at hand, but questioning the very foundation of your relationship. It was over something small at first, but the emotions it stirred up were anything but small. I thought, we're supposed to be in this together. Why is this so hard? The fantasy version of marriage didn't prepare me for those tough moments, the ones where you're not sure if you'll come out stronger on the other side or if you'll be forever changed by the tension. But those moments, as difficult as they were also part of the reality. They were where we learned about each other, about ourselves, and about the importance of communication. No one ever tells you that in marriage, you'll have to learn to argue constructively. That you'll have to learn not to just fight to be right, but to fight for the relationship itself. That sometimes it's not about winning the argument, it's about understanding, growing, and finding a way forward. The fantasy marriage had no room for those lessons, but the real marriage, it couldn't survive without them. Another part of the fantasy I struggled with was the idea that marriage would solve all my problems. I thought that by marrying my partner, everything in my life would suddenly align. I thought the loneliness I sometimes felt would disappear, that the struggles with self-worth would vanish, that together we create this perfect world. I expected the person I married to be my everything, the person who would complete me in every way. But the reality is that no one person can be everything to you, and expecting them to be is setting yourself up for disappointment. I had to learn that marriage didn't eliminate my own insecurities, my own fears, or my own need for growth. In fact, it often highlighted them. Instead of feeling complete, I sometimes felt exposed, vulnerable in ways I hadn't anticipated. The reality was that marriage didn't make me whole. It made me more aware of the parts of myself that still needed healing, still needed work. And that was hard to accept because in my mind, marriage was supposed to be this fairy tale escape from personal struggles. But it wasn't. It was in fact a mirror that showed me exactly where I needed to grow. Then there was the fantasy of how marriage would always be filled with romantic gestures and constant excitement. I thought we'd be the couple who never stopped dating, never stopped surprising each other with flowers and grand gestures. And there were times when we did do those things, but after a while, the grand gestures became fewer and farther between, and the reality of everyday life took over. Bills had to be paid. Schedules had to be managed. There were kids to take care of, work to attend to, household chores that didn't magically get done. And I realized that real love wasn't in the flowers or the romantic dates, it was in the little everyday moments. It was in the shared glances across the dinner table when you didn't have to say a word to understand each other, in the quiet support when one of us was having a rough day. The reality of marriage is that sometimes it's not about the big moments, it's about showing up for each other when it feels like nothing glamorous is happening. And then, of course, there was the fantasy that marriage would always feel like it did in the beginning, the excitement, the butterflies, the feeling that you could conquer the world together. I was naive enough to think that the love you feel at the start of a marriage stays the same forever. But as the years go on, you realize that love evolves. It doesn't disappear, but it changes. The intense passion of the early days mellows into something deeper, more consistent, more secure. That doesn't mean it's any less important. It just means that the nature of the connection shifts. The reality is that marriage isn't about maintaining a perfect version of what you first had. It's about growing together through the challenges and changes that life throws at you. It's about evolving as individuals while still holding on to the bond you share. The fantasy of marriage made it seem like once you found the one, everything would always be perfect. The reality is that marriage, even with your soulmate, requires work, emotional labor, time, and energy. It requires commitment, not just to the other person, but to the idea of the relationship itself. No one tells you this when you're standing at the altar, dreaming about happily ever after. They don't tell you that the real magic of marriage doesn't come from fairy tale moments, but from surviving the tough times, learning from the disagreements, and continuously choosing to love the person beside you, no matter how difficult, how messy, or how imperfect it may seem. That's where the real strength of marriage lies.